So today I'd like to talk about philosophy because I want to talk about the various aspects of philosophy in general, and then how it can help listeners apply its principles in like a practical way. I think a lot of people think of philosophy as like this kind of nebulous concept where people talk about like, are we in a simulation? And I'm sure that people do that as well. But I think I think philosophy at its core, in my opinion, and depending on the philosophy you're talking about, is meant as a guide for life and how to live your life. So that's really the aspect I'd like to see how we can apply that to today. And so, a lot of people think that they're going through the motions every day, and they're having a hard time finding meaning and purpose. So how can someone who feels stuck in a meaningless job or, a position in their life to find a sense of purpose using philosophy?
Yeah. So, I was just thinking, as I was driving over here, about Aristotle. I'm teaching senior seminar this year, and we always choose a theme. And the theme that I chose for our philosophy seniors this year is the intellectual life. Like, what does it mean what does thinking bring to your life? Like, what does it mean to live a life that involves thinking in general? And I was thinking, Aristotle famously said at the beginning of his Metaphysics that philosophy begins in wonder. Like, people first began to philosophize because they wondered about the world. And that for Aristotle is like that capacity for wonder really makes us human. Like, it makes us different from the animals, right? I mean, you don't find animals thinking about why they're here, right?
Yeah,
even if we could communicate, finding purpose, worrying about purpose, right?
Right.
And I mean, I think it's interesting to think in our own lives how easy it is to lose that capacity for wonder. If you think about children, right, and how excited they get when they see a new animal, or, and they want to know everything about it, and they have all kinds of questions. We get older and we get mortgages and kids and cars, and we lose that. We lose that kind of capacity to take interest in our surroundings and to ask why we're here, what our purpose is. Really to be able to begin to ask those questions is to philosophize, right? And philosophy is the love of wisdom. And so, you're probably expecting me to talk about like picking up a philosophy book, but honestly, I think the best thing that you could do is to take a walk. Find time in your day for silence, to sit outside, to appreciate your surroundings. I think those kinds of activities can begin to stimulate the philosophical spirit. Because I think all of us deep down have that kind of hunger for and curiosity, and just the desire to know what life is about and why we're here. And there's something dehumanizing about living a life in which you're so busy and spread so thin that you no longer care about those questions or even think to ask those questions.
Yeah, that's true. I think, I think there's like the hierarchy of needs, right? I think if like you're in a position to where, it's about perspective, right? If you are spending all your day working or walking 20 miles just to get water, right? There's a certain hierarchy of needs that need to be met, at that point. But I'd say in America and in most developed parts of the world, we have those needs met. And so a lot of times people think of these extracurriculars or our jobs and extracurriculars as necessities. We like conflate them with like, oh, I need to do these things to survive, when so much fluff can get cut out. And so the hard part is like remaining perspective on like what's necessary, what is a necessity in my life? Like, am I fed? Am I clothed? Do I have a roof over my head? And then everything else beyond that should be taking that second place, because that's, I think, what's stopping a lot of people from being present in that sense. Guys, if you're liking the content, please chuck a like on the video, and also don't forget to subscribe. That really helps me with the algorithm to get this video viewed by more of you guys. All right, back to the video.
Yeah, I mean, Zena Hitz. Have you heard of Zena Hitz?
Zena Hitz, no.
No. Okay, so she's a philosopher. She teaches at St. John's College, and she has a book called Lost in Thought. It's a popular, easily accessible book. I said I wasn't recommending books, but I recommend that book. It's a great book. Like anybody, I think a rapper endorsed it. I mean, it's very accessible. It's written for the everyday. MC Hammer is an endorsement on the book. But one thing that she points out in her book is that some of the greatest thinkers have their love for learning has been awakened through hardship. So Malcolm X in prison, right? Andre Weil, who's the brother of Simone Weil, a mathematician. He's in prison, and he finds the solution to this complex problem that he couldn't find anymore. I mean, sometimes we have to be shaken, and sometimes things have to be taken away from us, things that we think we want. Sometimes having that happen can kind of stimulate thinking about what really matters. I mean, it's complicated. You're right, because yes, if I'm just trying to find water so that I don't die of thirst, I'm probably not going to be being very philosophical, right? But as you pointed out, we're not thirsty in this country, like most of us, right? We're not hungry, but we are like, oh, I have to get home so I can take my kid to the 5-hour sports practice that is maybe going to get them into a Division I school if I'm lucky, or we let all of these things kind of clutter, and we never stop and ask why? Why do I care so much about all of these things? And sometimes we have to step back, and it's hard because those cares have a way of kind of creeping up and obsessing us and clouding our vision.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd say to people who have those basic needs met but are having a hard time finding a sense of purpose, or for some reason something feels quite lacking. And this is something that I've dealt with personally. I've delved into the realm of Stoicism pretty recently, and there's something there called the perception as reality, which is basically says it's not events that disturb them, but it's our perception towards those events that upset us. And it helped me reframe my position with what I do with teaching. I teach piano. So for a while, I'm 41. So in the last couple of years, I've had this it's something I fell into essentially, but I've been playing music my whole life. And so I always had this question about whether or not this is something that was I truly finding this fulfilling? I was always looking at the bad side of things. And so, I wasn't making enough money, regardless of how much money I was making, or, I could be doing something that's fulfilling. I'm around kids all day. I want to be around adults. Right. And as soon as I started to apply this philosophy to it, it started to shift my perspective for the better. I was thinking, I'm around kids all day. I want to be around adults, where I should have been thinking, and I do now, is I'm shaping these kids' futures in their lives. And, some of these students I've had for 6-7 years, and teaching them about, discipline, teaching them how to practice consistently, teaching them about ethic. I mean, that's something that's going to stick with them. I've had kids give me cars and tell me how much, I love you. And, I just never appreciated that. So I think that kind of mindset that I picked up helped kind of reshape that perspective.
I think there's a lot of truth there. Right. I definitely think there's a lot of truth there. And, one of the things I loved in Hitz's book that I was just talking about is she talks about kind of the humiliation of the search for truth, where you kind of have to learn to be content with you, So she tells a story of a movie of a guy who wanted to be a deep movie producer. He was a comic. Right. And he went and he tried to be a deep movie producer, and he failed miserably. But through various plot twists, he ends up in prison because of a case of mistaken identity. And he sees people watching his comedy movies that he made, and they're laughing. And he's like, wow, the thing that I thought was so meaningless, which is the only thing I'm good at, which is comedy, is bringing so much joy. Right. And so she talks about how we have this desire to make a difference. Right. And how a lot of time that's just vanity. often there's some small thing that we're good at.
Well, and it could be making a difference without us realizing.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
You have to. The way it makes a difference. She uses the example of a garbage man. The way it makes a difference. The garbage man gives a real service. The garbage man really makes a difference. When we think of making a difference, we don't think of that. We think of like curing cancer, ending hunger, right? We make a difference by being there and serving in small ways. And so you being there for your piano student and teaching them endurance and, discipline and encouraging them, like those are the things that really make a difference in someone's life at the end of the day, right? Much more than some like government program, right? Or whatever. Like it's our human interactions that make a difference. And so I think your point about the perspective is really right. I do think, I have reservations about Stoicism. There's a story about one of the Stoics, right? And someone he's propounding Stoicism, and someone comes up to him and tells him his daughter has died, right? And like the question is like, how is he supposed to react? Like, is he supposed to be like, oh yes, okay, well my daughter has, like it seems like there are things that ought to shake us. And so it can't there are friendship and love and all of these things, they do matter and they are important. And there's a way of being a Stoic that kind of takes the perspectivalness to the extreme. And I wouldn't want to go that far, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, there's the fine line between what makes us human, because for anybody listening who may not be too familiar with Stoicism, a lot of it is about taking what you can accept and really what you can control and really accepting it. But I think also Stoicism does get a bad rap for that reason. When you say you're Stoic, people think emotionless, right? But I don't think it's choosing to accept, right? Choosing to accept things and not turn a blind eye to them and not be emotionless about it. But I see your point, because if you are accepting of, say, someone dying, a loved one dying, because of you've practiced Stoicism in that sense, memento mori, thought about death and stuff and accepted it, then does that mean that you're not going to grieve or you're not processing the emotion properly? And that's a good question. I think it's in the balance of things. I would say I would be hard pressed to find somebody who practices Stoicism so well that the loss of a loved one would not shake them. But I think it could probably help them accept it and move on from it. But then again, it's a good point.
Well, I also do think that the question that arises when we talk about loss and things like that is the question of higher purpose. So St. Augustine in his Confessions, great book, very readable. He at the beginning of the book, he talks about a friend that was very close to him, he loved very much, and his friend died. And he just could not shake himself, could not shake the grief. Like he grieved and grieved. He says he took pleasure in his sorrow even. He just couldn't move past it. And Augustine is depicting this as something that was wrong with him. And there's a temptation to read that and be like, what do you mean? Like, of course you should. This was your best friend. Your best friend died. Of course you should be. But I think part of Augustine's point, and of course he goes on throughout the Confessions to detail other losses. Part of Augustine's point, I think, is that all of the things we love, he believes we should love in the proper way, right? So we should love our friend, but our friend is a child of God, and the friendship is given us by God, and we should see things in their proper context. So the friend isn't an end in his own right, or the spouse isn't an end in their own right. If you love anything, for Augustine, like if you love anything more than you love the source of your being, like there's something disordered there. All of our loves have to be put in the proper context. And so, I think that's the question that arises sometimes with Stoicism, right? Because Stoicism has, of course, it's a broad brush that has many different variations.
Sure.
But some Stoics have kind of religious views, right, about kind of what happens after death and us kind of being melded into the one and things like that. And so I do think it matters, like where we are in our relation, to the source of our being and to everything else, I think has to come into what it means to properly feel emotion or how we view loss and things like that.
Yeah, it's a good thought. It's a good point. Well, speaking of the philosophy, but also religion as well, in Stoicism and Christianity, we have, and these are things that have helped me apply it from both the four virtues of Christianity as well as the four Stoic virtues of courage, wisdom, justice, and temperament, or moderation. I guess same thing. Temperance, excuse me. But for me, having those virtues to strive for have helped me a lot. And I was wondering if maybe we could go through kind of each one and talk about ways in which people could apply them to their lives in a practical way to kind of help,
sure,
in all aspects. So we could start with, I guess you choose which one.
Okay. We can start with courage.
Courage. Okay.
No, it's interesting. And I think, you can find many different descriptions of virtue. And so, the one that I give might not be the one that somebody else gives.
Sure.
But we talk about courage, for instance, right? As, Aristotle says, well, it's a mean between feelings of fear and confidence. You feel the right amount of fear and the right amount of confidence. And that sounds right. Something that I find more illuminating. So I work on Thomas Aquinas, and so a lot of my views about virtue, that I find insightful come from Thomas Aquinas. But Aquinas talks about having virtue making you feel a kind of connaturality, so like a kinship, right, with certain goals of action. Okay, so if I was going to take courage, right, Aquinas thinks that courage is civic courage is kind of standing up for the good of justice, even at the risk of death, right? Like it matters so much to me to stand up for what is right that I'm willing to face death. Now, to have that, now we all probably think it's good to stand up for what is right, but to actually feel that, right, as a passion, right? Like I want deeply, right, to stand up for what is right. And like, it's like to the point that I kind of hunger for it and I'm motivated by it. If I feel it that strongly, that's going to help guide my actions, right? Like I'm going to be deeply upset when I see something, someone being treated poorly, or when I see something not right, right? And so, I like or similarly with, say, temperance, right? If we all think that we should moderate what we want to eat and drink, but not all of us feel a kind of revulsion for overeating, or like a kind of revulsion for the idea of getting drunk. Right?
Yeah.
Like we don't, right? But we probably know people who feel that way, right? And I think Aquinas, as I understand him, sees virtue in that way as a desiring. Now, I still need to think about what is the right amount to eat, right? I'm still going to have to figure that out.
Yeah.
But to intensely kind of feel the goodness of being faithful to your spouse, right? Or feel the goodness of like telling the truth, so that like you just feel a kind of revulsion for falsehood, right? That's, I like that conception of virtue, because I think it gets away from just kind of like, well, fear and confidence, and every situation's different.
Right.
I don't know. I think it adds something to the discussion to see it in that way.
Well, there's also the idea of just, faking it till you make it. I think a lot of times is like if you just accept that, okay, on paper, these virtues are ways in which I'm going to live my life, then now all I'm going to do is try to live to this higher standard and see what happens, and not attach, too much feeling towards it. Just we know what's right, we know what's wrong, and that's for me that the hard part with courage is, for moderation or temperance. I can easily, for your average listener, I can say, don't eat too much, don't work too hard, don't have too extreme feelings of one thing versus or another, kind of try to stay balanced, but applying courage to everyday life, maybe go do the things that frighten you to take charge in your career. Maybe that could be the thing. It's to me, it's one of those things that are more like long-term for me, maybe like career things that I like to do, or for me, fear of failure is a big one. So like not stopping or not doing something because the outcome may scare me. So like that I know requires courage. But in a practical sense, I'm trying to think of how someone can use courage on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, I think it's, of course, like, if you're Aristotle, like you only really exhibit courage when you're facing death and battle.
Right.
And it's like, how do we ever get there?
Like, how about something more practical,
yeah, exactly.
right?
So,
yeah.
But I think honestly, like the more you start thinking about situations in which you might need to stand up for what is right, the more common they seem. Like how many of us every day either speak poorly of somebody we know or don't speak up when other people are speaking poorly of someone we know, right? It takes, and we know, right, in our heart, like we know, like I should not be engaging in this conversation, right? But it takes courage to say, yeah, I don't really want to have, I don't want to talk about this, or, well, they have their good points too. Or, I think if we view courage as like standing up for what is right, we do that we have to do that all the time. It's talking about other people. It's, resisting the urge to like make a snide comment to your spouse or.
And that could fall under the justice kind of one, right?
Yeah, sure. Justice is kind of giving what is owed, and then courage is like standing firm in what you know to be right. And so like sometimes I have to say no, like I'm not going to do this. And I think that we fail in our opportunities to say, no, I'm not going to do this a lot. Yeah. C.S. Lewis has this beautiful little essay called The Inner Ring. And he was asked to speak to young people about kind of morality, right? And he says that the road to scoundrelism comes not through like big choices, but it comes through small choices that we make every day. And usually those choices, the bad choices that we make, come from a desire to fit in. Like we have a desire to be, part of the team that gets asked to do the difficult project, or we want to be part of the neighborhood circle
or
that
social
watches
creatures
TV.
In that sense, we want to be accepted.
Yeah, we want to be accepted, and we make moral compromises in order to be accepted. And that's where I think courage in everyday life, that's where it's going to come in, right? Where you kind of refuse to make those. Yeah. But you're right. Something else, I think you're absolutely right. You don't get the kind of hunger to stand up for what is right all at once. You have to make the choice to stand up for what is right repeatedly. And gradually it's going to change your affections. Yeah,
and going back to what you're saying about the social aspect of thing and having courage amidst the pressures of not, a lot of times people may not even see that what they're doing is a lack of courage, right? They don't even recognize that, hey, this is a moment for you to test this courage, to prove your courage in situations where it doesn't even come up. So first, it's having the wisdom to be able to know when do I need to use the courage. But then also, I would say, if you are able to notice it, I would say that the opposite of courage would be fear, right? And there might be others, I would say, but so I'm maybe speaking personally here. So maybe if there's other antonyms for it, but the idea is if you're sensing fear towards a certain action that either needs to be done, then you need to do the opposite, and then you will exhibit courage. I guess that would. Or
be even Aristotle says, even err in the opposite extreme. So like, if you're afraid and you know that you tend to be afraid, do the thing that seems like crazy rash to you. Like err on the opposite side, right? Or if you tend to courage can also involve restraining yourself, right? Some people, not everybody, but some people just rush in. And, some people say things, they say the offending thing, and some people need to rein themselves back.
Right.
And so I love Aristotle's advice, which is, he says just like a bow, you have to get the string on the bow, you have to overbend it, right? And it's the same way with us. If we want to change the way we act, we have to do what seems a little extreme to us in the opposite direction.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, absolutely. And also, you said, holding back exhibits courage. It's funny how that plays in line with moderation, but they play in line with one another quite well.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the ancients, there's contemporary people dispute this, but a lot of the ancients thought that you couldn't have one virtue without having them all.
That makes sense. The more we discuss it,
yeah.
the more
And
it's
it doesn't
clear.
mean, of course, that you have them all to the same degree.
Right.
But
sure.
it means that if you are going to really grow in one virtue, the other ones are going to have to grow too. Because you can't be, for instance, a courageous general in war and also be a drunk.
Right.
Because your alcohol habit is going to get in the way of you, fighting in the way that you should and things like that.
So that covers courage. And I would say, I'll speak personally. For me, I'll never consider myself wise, but I feel it's something that we're always achieving. And I feel if you apply, work on being more courageous, working on being more just, working on being more moderate, and like I said earlier, people who don't even realize that they're not being courageous or that they're being cowards, the wisdom is knowing that you are being a coward, right? That self-awareness. So for me, the moderation part of it, there are parts in which I'm lacking, but it's very clear to me where I can draw lines and improve in my life in the moderation aspect. And courage is slow, it's a bit nebulous to me, but I'm getting better at exemplifying it. Whenever I feel fear, I know, okay, this is what you need. This is the path you need to go down. What about justice? How can we simplify that in a way that can, how can you use justice in a way that's going to be practical?
So, I mean, oddly, justice is the most other-oriented of the virtues, if that makes any sense, right? Because justice is about giving other people what you owe them, right? And so if I'm just temperance, I can have all by myself, right? Even courage to some extent, because it's about me feeling in the proper way, right? But if I don't pay the person who teaches my kid piano lessons, they're starving and they'll do it for $1 an hour, but I don't pay them what their labor is worth. I'm being unjust, right? It's justice has a kind of essential relationship to other people in the way the other virtues don't. If they're, I'm not sure that you could be unjust to yourself, right? I mean, that's a conversation, but it seems like if you're going to practice justice, there has to be somebody to be just to. Right.
So it's the social aspect of the virtue, the way you interact with other people and the things that you do to be equitable and fair with others.
Right.
Patience. Being patient.
Yeah, patience
would fall under that.
Well, I mean,
how you treat others.
It depends.
I guess if you're dealing it with people, yeah.
It depends who you ask, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so, Aquinas, it's either annoying or interesting. For me, it's interesting. He kind of categorizes all the virtues. He has what falls under what, and what's a part of what.
Okay, great.
And it gets confusing though, right? Because you're well, why is it there? It should be here. He puts patience and perseverance actually under courage.
Really?
Because the idea is that you have to endure difficulty, right? To achieve your goal, right? So if you're fighting a battle, right? You have to be able to endure bullets coming at you, right? Or kind of a long slog in the mud and things like that. And so he puts patience and perseverance there as opposed to under justice. But of course, all of the virtues are going to have elements of all of the other.
They're going to kind of cross over with one another.
And certainly if you yell at your kid, when they really haven't done anything wrong because you're stressed out, it seems like you are doing an injustice to your child because what they deserve from you is calmness and patience. It seems like,
Right.
so they do seem interrelated.
Right. Having moderation or temperance and moderation in your mood is going to affect how just you are with other people. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And look, I want to talk about dealing with anxiety and uncertainty. A lot of people are overwhelmed with work, and that's this today's modern life. They're overwhelmed with anxiety. They've got a million things going on, and most of us in America aren't starving. Like our needs are met, but are constantly being bombarded with whether it's with social media or driving to and from work, meeting deadlines, all these things that are the extra on top of what is necessary. And what are some practices or techniques that you can use from any philosophy that can help deal with anxiety, this contagion that's kind of going over across America?
Well,
whether it's in your job or personal life.
I mean, I'll say two things. One, my students and I are reading this beautiful little book in our philosophy seminar. It's called The Intellectual Life. It's by a Dominican priest, A.G. Sertillange. It was written in 1920, right? So he's like, don't marry a chatterbox and things like that. But one of the things that he talks about, and I think one of that's really relevant to the kinds of questions you're asking, is the need for solitude, right? That the importance of being, getting away from everything and having time. I mean, he thinks that time should be used in study because he's talking about it, living a certain kind of life, and it should. But I think just even the importance of quiet, right? We're so busy. We never and linked to the importance of quiet, though, is what you use the quiet for. And I think one of the things that it's easy to lose sight of is the questions of purpose. Like, why are we here? Like, what makes sense of the fact that I'm running here and there, trying to pay my mortgage and worried about paying for the travel team and all this kind of stuff? We can treat, to use example of children, many people treat getting their child into a top tier school as if that's the entire point of their and their child's life.
I see it a lot with a lot of my students and their parents, for sure.
If your child isn't happy,
you mind pulling that in just a tiny bit?
Sorry. If your child isn't happy, right? Yeah. Or you don't have a relationship with your child at the end of this process. Yeah. Or you're not happy and you don't, and your relationship is shot. What was it all for? Who cares? Right? But we don't think about that. I don't think we spend enough time thinking about why we're here and why our lives matter. And one of the reasons why we don't think about those things is because we don't have any time, right? It's a vicious cycle. So I'm so worried about my child's piano recital that I don't leave any time for my child in their day to just be bored and think and wonder
and be
think about how horrible it is to rob a child of the thing that Aristotle says makes them human, right? That sets them apart, and it's a capacity for wonder. And you're not enriching your child's capacity of wonder when you take every free minute out of their day.
I think I couldn't agree with you more. I think again, what you just expressed is pretty much in line with. It's saying the same thing as what I was going to say, which has to do with being present, right? Taking time to, personally, I overthink. So when I'm thinking about work stuff or something, I'm just constantly thinking. And so a hard part for me is to shut that off and just observe, be where I am.
Yeah.
I think that's what plagues a lot of people too. They're always thinking about the next thing. And that's the problem with anxiety. It's you're either thinking about the past or the future, but not the present. Yeah. And so I think that this is perfect.
This little book, he has some really concrete advice. And I will say that it has been life-changing for me. And his advice is take the best hour of your day, and spend it on what you love the most. So and for me, that means getting up an hour before anybody else, or 2 hours if I can, before anybody else in my house is awake. And I like to write philosophy, and I devote, and that's my time. It's quiet. I'm doing what I love. And I have found that transformative in my life. Everybody has an hour a day.
I do.
Everybody has an hour a day. Yeah, and it's life changing.
I walk, but I do the same thing.
Yeah, it really grounds the rest of your day. And I've come like I don't necessarily want to get up, but I look forward to that time, and like that time and when I don't have it, I feel it.
Yep.
And that's a really easy, practical thing that anybody can do. And I've talked like people that I respect that have made a lot of their lives, some of whom have like 8 children. Like they tell me that they've done that too. And
so no excuses.
no excuses, right? I mean, if you're no excuse for, and I think if you're married and you need to help your spouse find that time too.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I think that just giving the space for you to think and wonder. And for him, it's, devote it to, like for you, it would be music, right? For me, it's philosophy, but like devote it to that activity that like gives you the most fulfillment.
For me, it's probably not music. Music gives me fulfillment, but again, it's one of those things where it'll consume me. So I'm one of these people.
So you need the space
for me.
From
I
it.
need the time to just literally just be like, I guess meditative thinking. So writing in that sense, if I do write, it's writing thoughts. It's writing just things I observe about myself. It's introspection.
Right.
Because I feel like I lose that when I'm thinking about, a million other things.
Yeah.
So, there's, I'm going to talk a lot about Stoicism because that's where what I'm familiar with. But there's the Stoic reserve clause is like acknowledging that the outcome of an action is not always within your control too.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's something that people who are dealing with anxiety are always trying to control things, right? It's like I was talking about this earlier with one of my friends. It's like no matter what you do, even if you set everything up straight, you can send your kids off into the world and try to rear them as best as you can, but they're not going to go in the direction that you think they're going to go. No. So for me, as a person example with just this podcast, I've wanted it to, I've had the fear of whether or not this is going to be successful, but I've come to terms with that, whether it does or doesn't, I have no control over that. Like I can only do what I can do to the best of my ability. And then beyond that, have to accept it. Like having the fear and worry about whether something is or is not going to pan out is kind of wasted effort.
But even beyond that, like I've really been thinking a lot lately about how failure is a gift.
The obstacle is the way.
No matter what we do, we're going to fail because nobody plays a piano as well as it can be played.
Right.
Like nobody runs a podcast as well as it can be run. Like nobody gets at the entirety of truth. So any philosophy paper I write, I'm going to fail in some sense because I'm not going to do it. Like, but that's a gift, right? Like all we can do is like make inroads towards perfection.
Right.
And so we always fail.
Right.
And when you stop trying to think of like, I think maybe we focus on other people's markers of how well we do.
Yeah, for sure.
When really it's the struggle that gives the meaning, right? And if you learn to just kind of, and none of us do, I'm not saying I've learned this, but if to the extent that we learn to embrace our inevitable failure and to like embrace the struggle as meaningful in itself,
right? I
think that can be transformative for
I think that's great. Yeah, exactly. Embrace. Well, so many people are so hell bent on the destination, right? We're so focused on where we want to be that every hurdle to get us to that destination is like a battle. Yeah. And the viewpoint is negative, right? Yeah. Like I just want to get there, I want to put up with this so I can get to that point.
And 90% of the time when you get there, you're not satisfied with it. It's just totally disappointing.
Yeah. So shifting your perspective to actually enjoy what you're doing in whatever shape or form, acknowledge that the process is where you're going to get the enjoyment out of it. And that shift in perspective is huge for sure. I'm working on that constantly, but I think again, it's like it's the wisdom side of the virtue we're talking about, just acknowledging that and being able to recognize that, hey, yeah, this isn't so bad if I view it like this, right? So the perspective, shifting that perspective is everything. I want to talk about now navigating relationships with, social interactions with our friends, with our loved ones, it can be hard, right? Misunderstandings are common. So what specific philosophical principles can improve communication in personal relationships between like partners or friends?
I was just reading this morning. I wonder if I'm going to be able to find it. Oh, wow. It's right here. So I was just reading, this is this guy who wrote The Intellectual Life that I was just talking about before. And he says, learn to listen, and listen first to anyone. Right. So his thing is that we can learn from anybody we meet. Like we're in a big hurry to kind of impose our will and like give everyone our insights. When anyone we meet, any other human being, has something that we can learn from. And
why is that? I agree. It's so hard to do.
It's very hard to do because we're wrapped up in ourselves.
Yeah.
And we think we know everything. Like we think we have a view. But I mean, his point is that if you really care about learning and you really want to approach the world, like you should want to approach all of reality with the attitude of a student. And the meekest, most insignificant person has something to teach us because they're in the world. Like they're in the world too. It doesn't mean that they're all, they've all got everything figured out, but we can learn from them. And I mean, I think for me, I know I have trouble listening. Like I want to rush in and solve everything. And but I think when on the other hand of the equation, like as a teacher, I know that like students more than anything else, like they don't care if you agree with them. They don't necessarily care if you don't give them good grades. They want to feel heard though, right? And if they feel patronized, it's over between you, right? But if they honestly feel that you are trying to understand their point of view and listen to them and reply, it just changes things in the classroom. And I think that's true of our relationship with anybody.
Yeah, no, I agree. If you listening to your spouse and just actively listening and not just dismissing what they're saying. Yeah,
right. And it's so hard.
Yeah.
Like, it's so hard. And with children too, because children say so much.
Yeah. Trying to filter out the...
It's like, how much of this do I need to pay attention to?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's any other kind of ways in which social interactions can be helped with. I mean, there's, the quintessentials, treat others as you'd like to be treated, but that's just so generic. It's like, what about coping with big change or loss? So, I'm sure there's some principles we can think about where, for example, say you lose the loved one, or you've big life changes, losing a loved one, graduating college, going to a new school, moving, all these big changes, getting a divorce, retirement. What are some examples of how, or some practices that you could use to help with big changes, whether it's loss or big changes in life?
Well, I mean, philosophy and religion are different things.
Yeah.
Right. But I think one thing you notice about people with very deep faith is they handle those things better. And one reason why they handle those things better is because they recognize that they are not in control, right? That they can control maybe a little bit, right? You can control your reactions to things, but you can't control what happens.
Sure.
And they believe in a purpose that they can't understand, right? So there's a kind of submission there. But I think that the philosopher, and especially the Stoics who you like, understand the importance of that submission in a sense too.
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah, there's the concept of impermanence, accepting things that you have no control over. Like I was saying earlier, you can, William Tell can aim the arrow over his son's head and let it go, but if the wind's blowing, there's nothing he can do to
Well, and then there's also the notion of the integrity of one's character and life being the one thing that really matters and the only thing that other people can't control, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, Socrates famously says in the Republic that even if you're being, you know, if the just man is tortured and has his eyes put out and loses his money and his children and everything else, just because he's a virtuous person, he will be happy. Happier than he would be if he had all the money in the world and wasn't virtuous.
Right.
That just being a person of integrity and being centered and living a moderate and just life in which you're not a slave to your desires, but you think about how you ought to live. That is a happiness in itself.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's a very powerful idea.
Yeah. In line with the Stoic, as far as dealing with loss, there's the concept of memento mori, which is the idea of, I carry a coin actually in my pocket, but it's know that you're going to die, essentially. And it's not meant to be somber or macabre. It's supposed to remind you that at any moment anything can be taken from you. And so it's a practice that should be done regularly so that you can more appreciate the things that are there when they're there. Yeah.
And Socrates in the Phaedo says that philosophy is preparation for death. Right, so that hooks nicely with the memento mori.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
It's a distancing yourself from the bad attachments and the bad cares and all of the like little things that you kind of dissipate your energies into.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another concept known as amor fati, which is like love your fate, right? And for me, this has been something that's kind of that I've come to recently, because before I would my faith is something, or my fate is something. I always thought you could control fate 100%, and like I'm in control of my fate no matter what. But even if you try to control everything, no matter what, your fate is destined, because whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Even if you think you have control, it's that illusion of control. I have an example that I wrote down because I wanted to share. But at 67, Thomas Edison lost all of his works in a giant fire in New Jersey. And this is, he called his son. I'm not sure if this is the first account, but he called his son and say, "Come down here, come watch this beautiful fire," kind of a thing. You'll never get a chance to see it. And then the next day he started to rebuild. They started clearing the rubble and rebuilding. So, that mindset of rebuilding and moving forward, even after loss, even after, setbacks is a great mindset to have. So speaking of loss, I want to read to you top 5 regrets people had in the last 12 weeks of their lives. So these accounts were chronicled by somebody called Bronnie Ware, who's an Australian nurse and works in hospice care. So, and we can go through each one. You can give me feedback if you want to or not, but I feel it's an interesting way to view loss, because a lot of people have the same thing at the end. When we're at the end of our road, I think there's always these common regrets that people have. The first one was, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And I feel like that's such a huge aspect for people. I would say, I'm not going to say it's a firstborn issue, but I think a lot of kids learn that from their parents, wanting to please their parents and do right by their parents. But the fact that this is one of the top 5 prevalent issues is that people not choosing to be their authentic self or making decisions based on what other people might feel is an interesting one.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Second one was, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. This was every male patient, and I'm sure female, but they said every male patient felt they missed their children's youth and partner's companionship, which goes back to being present, right? Yeah. Enjoying the moments that you do have with the kids that you have, and not being so turned, on your phone, thinking about everything, all the million things that you need to do. But it's hard. It's hard, right, especially in today's busy world. Number 3, I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. See, I've never had that issue, but I know that a lot of people do. I wonder, how about you?
No, I mean, I think with like all of the things you're mentioning, I just think, I don't, if I hadn't majored in philosophy and like become a philosopher and things like that, I don't think I would now appreciate the importance of caring about my child's happiness and the happiness of my family and all of like, I mean, Aristotle says at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics that everybody agrees on what's the goal of human life. It's happiness. But like nobody agrees on what that is. Like some people think it's wealth, some people think it's money, right? And I think a lot of people go through life, which I think this is what what the list speaks to. A lot of people go through life chasing one conception of happiness, and that proves disappointing, and then they chase another conception of happiness, and that proves disappointing, and they chase another conception of happiness, right? And Aristotle, depends on how you read him. Of course, people disagree, but he thinks that the goal of life, again, I mean, he's the one who said philosophy begins in wonder, like the true happiness is found in contemplation, right? And in kind of thinking about the highest truths and our purpose and why we're here. And he doesn't think you can do that unless you cultivate the virtues, right? Unless you kind of distance yourself from disordered, inordinate attachments. But I think that like having read that as a 17-year-old, like helps me now say, it doesn't really matter if my kid is like not great on the swim team or like, doesn't win I still think that kids should have hard things that they do.
Right.
But like, I don't care if they're not like a wonderful pianist or if they're like not on the elite sports team or whatever. Because like back when I was 17, I read Aristotle, and Aristotle talked about the point of life being happiness and convinced me that happiness is not honor, fame, power, wealth, right?
Right.
But I don't think people think about that enough.
Yeah, no, I think, unfortunately, I feel like, and that's why I said at the beginning of the podcast, the idea of people don't understand what philosophy at its core is supposed to be. But it's misunderstood, and it has been given not a bad rap, but it's so much more practical than it should be, and that's what the whole purpose of this podcast is: try to share with people that like it can absolutely. It can actually do that. Yeah. And if it did that for you at 17, it can do that to anybody at 17.
Yeah, I think absolutely, or at any age, any age. Right. Can I ask how we're doing on time?
We're good. Yeah, I mean, it's 2:25.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You good?
Yeah, I'm
good. What time do you have to be gone?
No, I didn't know. I saw that 1:50, and I was like, have we been talking for 2 hours?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, that thing's off. Yeah, I'm by now.
Okay.
You get stuck in a bubble when you're in here.
I have to practice piano with my daughter before I go out to dinner with my husband. So
that's
I'm
great.
good. I'm
okay,
good.
great.
Yeah.
I forgot what we were saying.
We were talking about studying philosophy at any age kind of helps you reorient your priorities. So
when I was younger, I had some exposure in college to philosophy, but again, I didn't pay too much mind to it. The concepts of, maybe because I was just trying to figure out like what it meant to be independent, like from a practical standpoint, like got to do my laundry, you got to do this, you got to have my life together. That I wasn't, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It's like if you don't have those basic things kind of there, you don't have time to even contemplate those things. And sometimes you're not ready for it. Not everybody's ready for it. But I think it should be taught that even if you don't think you're ready for it, you are. Oh yeah. It's like if you take the time to contemplate and do it the right way and understand it, then it can completely change how everything else functions in your life. Well, and things that you don't think affect you have a way of affecting you anyway. I think it's so important. Of course, at UD, we make all the students take 3 philosophy courses. Like we really run them through the ringer. And they don't want to do it, but it's my favorite course to teach. Like I've been teaching freshman philosophy now since 2004, at least once a year. Like sometimes more than once a year. Like we read Plato, Aristotle, like all, and I love it. Because there's nothing more human. Like there's nothing that matters more than thinking about, Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that's really true. I think that is so true. Yeah, I agree completely. Let's see, let's finish out this list. Number 4 was, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And then number 5 is, I wish I had let myself be happier. That's interesting. They realized that happiness was a choice. Yeah. I wonder what let myself be happier. Like, I wonder what's at. I think the way I take it is we're so preoccupied with external things to bring us happiness, right? You think that by doing this action, you'll be happy, by doing that, rather than just being and just enjoying what you're doing.
Or just the ability, like I notice I'm kind of super like punctual and like I get things done and I'm never late and all this kind of stuff. And something that I really admire in my husband is his ability to just like be in the moment. You know, like if he's having a conversation with someone, like he loses track of the time.
Right.
And those are the best conversations, right? Where you just like, you're there and you're just enjoying yourself. But I have this tendency to be like, okay, let's see, it's almost bedtime for Sage, and like,
were you firstborn?
I'm youngest, actually, but like we're so worried, right, about like putting everything in its place that like we become unable to relax.
Yeah.
And look, I think being punctual is a really good thing. Yeah. And like, I think structure in kids' lives are really important. But I think that's the beautiful thing about marriage. Like, we also need the ability to just like be.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think the balance, right? Finding times when to just shut that off, you know, and like you were saying, doing that for you in the morning, the time that you allot yourself for your morning to just do that, or more importantly, and I've been doing this with my wife as well, since I've been going on this journey myself, is giving each other personal time away from the kids as well. And I've had to like push and say, no, you need to take this time for yourself, even though she doesn't realize that she actually truly needs this.
It's hard.
But once you are able to kind of disconnect and have that time for yourself, it's life-changing. Yeah. And so I would say control everything that you want to control, but don't attach too much emotion towards it, because like we said, at the end of the day, you will. And what I mean is too much negative emotion. It's like if you're choosing to be stressed because you're on time, you can choose to be on time but not stress about it, right?
Yeah.
Because what's the point?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So speaking of finding joy and peace in everyday life, so in America especially, this is not true of the whole world, but I'd say in America for sure, we're constantly encouraged to achieve more, be, like you were saying, be the best, so finding joy in simple everyday moments can be hard. I'm going to quote Epicurus taught that true happiness comes from the simple pleasures of friendship and a calm mind. So how can we practice Epicurean philosophy to find joy in our lives and appreciate simple pleasures like friendship and cultivate this calm mind?
I mean, I think that like a big thing is probably just doing less, like that Sertillange, who I had his book. He has a saying. He says, like, great men, one doesn't think of great men going out to dinner, which is interesting, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't go out to dinner. I love going out to dinner, right? But if we're so chock full of busyness, like most of us, I think it's sad. Like a lot of us don't have people over anymore, and why do we not have people? Well, most of us don't have time to have people over. Like most of us don't, like we have too much stuff going on. You got the like Girl Scout meeting and you got the this and you got the that and you got the, right? And you're like running through the drive-through to get, right? And we could cut out a lot of that stuff out of our lives. Yeah. Like we could just have, I have a rule with my daughter, like you can do music and you can choose one other thing. Like we're not doing, like during the school year, we're not doing more than two things. Like and I think we can do that with ourselves too. And we can just do less. We don't need to fill our lives with chatter, because it really is just kind of like chatter and noise. If
you think about it at the end, what's it all for?
No, exactly. Right. And I just think you have to say no, right? My life is going to have space in it. My children's lives are going to have space in it, even if they don't go to Harvard. Like, who cares?
Right.
Like, they're going to have climbed a tree, and they're, and like maybe that's more important.
No, I agree. I mean, so our daughters are both 7. It's funny you mentioned extracurricular activities. She's been pretty serious about ballet, so now she's going twice a week because she's in the higher level. And they started jujitsu, so they're going twice a week. So she's got that, and I teach her lessons, and like she's trying to find time to practice. And so now, we wrote a schedule out. I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for this. I don't know. I'm like, it crossed my mind literally earlier today, and I'm like, I want her to continue music because that's something that she's been doing for years. But I'm like, and the jujitsu is practical, but then you have the ballet, and it's just taking up. Like she's home, she has to do all these things, and she's even complaining about it. I'm like, that time will come, but it's so important for these, especially in these years, for us to know what it is to have to work hard. Yeah, that's fine, but to not have the time to just be,
and to be bored, and to read, and to just like, I think that the most wonderful thing in the world is when a kid complains that they're bored, right? Because like, I want to watch TV or whatever, but if like you're just like, no, you're going to have to find, and like not 30 minutes later, they are entertaining themselves in the most elaborate game. And that's building their curiosity and their interest in things and their joy. And like, I feel like we as a society have just taken that away from children. And I think it's so sad.
You're right. Yeah. When was the last time you would say you felt bored?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
I never feel bored.
That's the thing. I'm trying to think as an adult, and I think that's a good problem that I want to have, because I remember feeling bored at some point a few times in my life, but that was a long time ago. Because it's if I feel like I'm about to be bored, what can I do? Grab my phone.
You can grab your phone, start scrolling.
Yeah. And so knowing to take certain things out of the equation that are like boredom fillers, the phone being the big one.
Yeah. And television.
And television.
My daughter said to me the other day, because, over summer, like they watch more TV than they do during the school year and things like that. And she wanted to watch TV. And I said, no. And she was, she said, well, I said, you actually I don't like you when you watch too much TV. Like you're not happy. Like you're thinking about how much more TV you can watch. Yeah. And she says, it was so interesting, right? She's 7. She goes, well, I feel happy when I'm watching TV. But then when I'm stop watching TV, I feel worse. And I just thought that was so insightful.
It's like a drug.
It is. It's a drug. Yeah. And I mean, tablets are worse than that.
For sure.
All
right, let's talk about self-compassion. So we're our own worst critic. Of course, I am. I'll speak personally. Taoist philosophers emphasize the importance of going with the flow and being gentle with ourselves. What are some principles that can help someone develop self-compassion and reduce this self-criticism? What are some philosophical principles that we can kind of put into place?
I mean, I would put it not as being gentle with ourselves, but like allowing ourselves to fail. You're never gonna, I think we have, maybe our culture too is this kind of culture of achievement, and like we rank ourselves by like how good we are at various things. Mm-hmm. If you're interested in a life of virtue and purpose ordered towards finding the truth, like that's a slog, and you're not going to get there all at once. And to the extent you think you ought to already have gotten there, you're going to be incapable of pursuing it, right? But like no one, like think about somebody who goes on a diet and they want the diet to be over in a week. Well, they're not going to be successful. And if the diet's, even if they do lose some weight in a week, if they go off the diet, they're done, right? But if you think of it as like, I've got to change my life, and life changes are gradual and slow and they don't happen all at once. That's a much more productive, like it maybe takes more to buckle down to it, right? Because you're in for something that never ends, but it's also much more sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say being okay failing, or just...
And maybe it's not necessarily okay failing, but acknowledging that failing is going to happen, and you start again tomorrow, right? If you fail today, well, you're gonna keep trying.
Right. Let the chips fall where they may. Yeah. Right. And even if you succeed, and of course we want to feel good about success and acknowledge it, but also know that not to overindulge in that success, right? Not to say, oh, I'm the best now because I've accomplished this, because you can easily get knocked down very easily. there's in Wu Wei, I just researched this. So it's a concept of effortless action or non-doing, which means going with the natural flow of life instead of trying to force the outcomes. So in this case, it means stopping the need to constantly criticize or push ourselves, which is exactly what this is. It's like, allowing ourselves to be imperfect. I think is perfectly in line with that.
Although at the same time, like you are exerting effort, right? Like you are trying to become better at various things,
right?
But I think it's like they use the phrase "you want it too much." Right. There's a way of wanting things that's counterproductive.
And it takes away the joy out of doing it in the first place.
Yeah, it takes away the joy, and it takes away the likelihood of success, right? Because you have to say, like, this is who I am.
Right.
And if this is not compatible with, if you're religious, if this is not compatible with God's plan for me, I don't want it.
Yeah.
Right? Or if this is not compatible with a well-lived life, I don't want it.
Right.
A lot of people can't say that about stuff. And, like, I think myself at a certain point in life, I couldn't say that. Right? When you want something to the exclusion of considerations about whether it's good for you, whether it's going to make you happy, whether it's going to add meaning to there is a way of wanting things that you don't care if it's going to make you miserable. You want it.
Right.
And that's the destructive way of wanting, I think.
I agree. Not seeing the forest for the trees, like, for sure. Whether it's, I never had huge admiration aspirations of being a concert pianist, but there's definitely a lot of pressures on musicians when they're younger to get to this certain level of performance. And, I think coming to terms with the fact that, and the same with athletes, who work their whole lives in a pursuit, and then to realize that this isn't going to happen for them, and to come to that acceptance. But when you do accept it, it's such a relief.
Yeah, for sure. It is.
Yeah. So it's good to be able to treat yourself with that kind of, I guess, that kindness and understanding that, nobody's perfect, and somebody's going to be better than you. Someone's going to be better than the person you think is the best. So, and then we were talking about juggling earlier, about juggling time in your life between spending time with your kids and for yourself. So a lot of people have a hard time balancing goals or work goals with their social life, spending time with their friends and spouse and children. So what are some philosophical practices we can apply to find a balance between our own personal desires and then our responsibilities to others,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you have to think about what are the most important things. And I think you have to make sure that those get space and priority in your life. But then I also think that you have to realize, I think there's an entire philosophy to be done on the notion of self-gift and what that means, right? But one thing self-gift doesn't mean is self-annihilation, right? And so I think you have to give of yourself. Like, first off, you have to keep what matters in focus, right? Like, that has to get your time, your faith, your family, right?
Your health,
right? Those things have to. And if they fall out of place in your life, then something's very disordered. But then I also don't. It's possible, especially for women, to have this view that, like, I can just annihilate myself in the service of everything else. But, like, if you're not full, if you're not fulfilled, if you're not happy, you're not a good spouse or a good mother. You're not even good at practicing your religion, right? You have to, like, think about what you need in order to be able to give the most that you can give to other people. So I don't know that I have any principles, but I do think that, like, you do have to think about your priorities, and I think it's so easy, especially when children are small. Like, you can make something silly, like for me, it's like nap time, right? Because, like, nap time is your only break,
right?
And you can, like, make nap time a god that you're not willing to intrude upon, and it's just silly, right? If you're, like, ruining family relationships or, like, ruining all this stuff because, like, the world is going to end if your child doesn't get a nap, or, like, we just get fixated on stuff.
Right.
And I think it's important to take stock of, like, what this says about what our highest value is. And so often it turns out our highest value is something really silly.
Yeah.
So to have that kind of self-examination in the first place, I think, is super important.
Yeah. Yeah. That's well said. Absolutely. Some of these topics I want to talk about, we kind of already covered. So, but I wanted to talk back about the failure aspect, which ties along the line I was mentioning, that the amor fati, love your fate concept. I wanted to give a couple examples. Aside from me in the performance aspect in the performance world, being hard on myself after a rough performance, those are things, giving yourself grace for that, but also realizing that failure is what makes us who we become, and so we can use it as a source of fear or as a source for us to draw courage from to push through, Michael Jordan wouldn't be who he was if it wasn't for failure. He failed. Nelson Mandela was in jail for like 27 years. Thomas Edison, like 1,000 failed inventions or so before inventing the light bulb. So failures do make us who we are. Ryan Holiday has a book called The Obstacle is the Way. And it talks about embracing our failures and our obstacles as the way to make us and shape us into who we are. Because without those obstacles, who are we? Without the things that challenge us to grow, I wouldn't be where I am today without any of them. So I think what virtue would that be? Like practicing that virtue, I guess it could be perseverance,
probably.
Yeah, I mean. The option, and when you think about it, embracing, setbacks or stress, embracing these things, these obstacles, is the easiest way. Because if you just embrace them, then you're not stuck there being miserable all the time anyway. Yeah. So not only is it going to make you a better person and make you strive towards it, but then if you change your perspective towards those things, it's just going to make your life that much better.
Right.
I've suffered when I was younger. And I've gotten better about it as I've gotten older with procrastination and laziness.
Okay.
I guess in certain aspects, I'm sure we all have that in certain aspects of our life. But Aristotle believed that building a good habits and virtues in fulfilling, building a fulfilling life. So could you explain his concept of eudaimonia?
Oh, eudaimonia. Yeah. So, taken literally, that means having a good daimon. Right? Like you're blessed, right? But
what's daimon?
Like a daemon, like
a spirit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but what he's really talking about there is flourishing, right? Like you look at a tomato plant, right? And some tomato plants grow well and are healthy, and some are like sickly and dying, right? Well, the healthy tomato plant with the beautiful red tomatoes is flourishing, right? It's everything you could want a tomato to be, right? Well, Aristotle thinks that about human beings too. Happiness for him is flourishing. When a human being is everything you could want a human being to be, that's flourishing. And a lot of that, we're rational beings, right? If you want to understand what makes something, what something's flourishing is, you have to look at its purpose. You have to look at what sets it apart from all other things. Well, human beings are able to use reason to guide their lives. And if that's what makes us what we are, then we flourish most when we use reason to guide our lives well, right? And that's why we need virtues, right? That we have to develop the habits that allow us to live in a way that really expresses correct thinking about the way to live. Like we don't get addicted to stuff. Like that's a very obvious example of using your reason poorly, right? You become enslaved to a substance, right? But also running away from something that you know is worth fighting for. Well, that's a poor use of, that's
lack of courage.
Yeah, that's a poor use of reason and action, right? Or failing to give somebody what you recognize you owe them, right? And we are social, for Aristotle, we are social creatures. Like that's a failure of thinking about how we should live, right? And so the flourishing life, that's eudaimonia, right? Being exhibiting the fullest and best.
And that's by following the virtues.
It's partly. Now, I think people forget this about Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that cultivating virtue is the element of flourishing that we control, right? Okay. But Aristotle says, and I love this, and people ignore that he says it, Aristotle says that happiness, so what we translate as happiness, Aristotle calls eudaimonia. Like that's the word, right? Okay. But that if you think of somebody whose life exhibits the fullness of a human life, that sounds like happiness to me.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Aristotle says that happiness is what we pray for. Virtue is the element of happiness that we control. If you're virtuous, you're going to be as happy as you can be through your own efforts.
Uh-huh.
But you don't control whether your children die or
Right.
whether, your great-grandchild turns out to be a serial killer or whether your house burns down, right? And Aristotle, unlike Plato and Socrates, thinks that those aspects of life which are outside of our control do contribute to our happiness, right? So
Well, what can we do about them?
we can't do anything about them. That's why
Right.
happiness is what we pray for. If you're virtuous, you can be as happy as it is possible for you to be through your own efforts. But you could be the most virtuous person in the world if you live all alone and you have, you're shipwrecked on a desert island.
Right.
Aristotle says no one would call that person happy except to defend a philosopher's paradox. That's where Aristotle differs from Plato and the Stoics, right?
Right. For sure.
But
Zeno, who
is
very famously wrecked his ship and lost his ship and was perfectly happy because
the thing is, people like that or they hate it. I like it. I think it's true. And I think we have to recognize that like complete happiness in this life is not under our control, right? What we can take action about is the kind of person we are. Right. And if you live a good and orderly life, you'll be as happy as it is possible for you to be, right? But you have to recognize that these other things, whether my children turn out well, right, or whether the stock market crashes, that do actually add flourishing to your life in important respects, are also not under your control.
So how would Aristotle argue or find ways to find happiness if something beyond your control were to happen?
Well, you are happy, right? You have a peace of mind, but there's a greater happiness, right? So you're as happy as it is possible for you to be, right? I mean, so for instance, I didn't have a child until I was 41 years old. We didn't think we could have kids. Wonderful surprise. We had a daughter. I am so much happier having a child in my life. Like, it's just like, I feel like somebody like turned on the lights in my life, right? It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
If I had never had a child, would I be unhappy? No, I have a great husband. I have all these wonderful things that I really like am grateful for. But I have a gift that is out of my control that I got to have a child, right? And I'm happier for that, right? But like, happiness isn't owed us. I think that's what Aristotle sees, right? What we can, and it's not like if you never had a child, you would therefore have a bad life, right? Or be miserable.
Right.
But there's a greater, happiness is something that things outside our control can add to. I just think that's true.
Or take away from.
Take away to some extent, right? I mean, if there was a tragedy, if you found out that your wife had a terminal illness, your happiness would be impeded, right? Even if you were the most virtuous person in the world. Right. Because you are the most virtuous person in the world, you would handle that as well as that news could possibly be handled. And you would be happy as somebody whose wife had a terminal illness could be, right?
Right.
But there's something that would make you happier, and it's your wife not dying from a terminal illness, right?
That makes sense. That's a great way to put it. Awesome. That's great. What about when it comes down to ethical decisions? Okay. Whether it's in their careers, deciding whether to speak up about a problematic thing at work. Obviously, this goes in with the line of courage. But can you discuss specific philosophical practice to help guide with someone making these decisions outside of that? Like, how would someone use that practice to resolve like a moral dilemma?
Well, I mean, just in terms of what we were just talking about, like, I think that the issue of what's outside your control is very important here, right? We have this tendency to want to be the architects of all the consequences that come in the world, right? And we're like, oh, well, I can't speak up because then I might like not get promoted, and then I wouldn't be able to pay for travel soccer, and like we do all this stuff, right? Right. We don't control that stuff. We control the kind of person that we are. Like, we control whether we do the right thing or the wrong thing. And I think when you dial it back, like our desire to control everything that happens in the world, We dial that all the way back and recognize, no, like I control whether I'm a good person or a bad person. And I recognize that this practice is wrong. I'm required to speak out of it. I don't control what happens after that, but I do control the kind of person. I do control how I behave.
There's a consequence for that.
Of course.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
But you don't, there is, but I think we see those consequences with far more accuracy than we actually do. Mm-hmm. There's a beautiful book by, it's called The Hiding Place. It's by the Corrie ten Boom, who hid people from the Nazis in Holland. And, a big theme in that book is like, of course they're worried about consequences, right? But it's clear in the book that like what's more important to them than consequences is doing the right thing. And there are amazing, instances that she relates of like, she gets called in by the Gestapo and, she's, they're like, tell us where these people are that you're hiding. Like, how can you, because she's hiding the mentally disabled and things like that, right? And how can you think these lives have value? And she just, she just tells the guy, her beliefs and what she thinks of him, and that she thinks he's doing evil things and that all life has, and surprisingly, this Gestapo says to her, yeah, I feel this darkness inside of me. Like I can't sleep at night. Like this is horrible to me. Of course, he sends her on to the concentration camp anyway, right? But that moment, to me, that's so powerful, right?
Yeah.
Because you see the line of reasoning. It's like, okay, I have to like tell this Gestapo guy this lies that make him think that this or that. That's a person, right? And that's a person who can be affected by my words. And she spoke the truth to him.
Right.
And she affected him. And like, you never know where that goes, right? And so I don't think we can try to plan out all the far consequences of our actions. I think we just have to think about like, what kind of person am I? And that's why virtue matters so much. So
in a case like that, to exhibit the utmost virtue, do you, because lying obviously is not a virtue, right? Yeah. It's the opposite of one. Would you lie to help save the other person, or would you say, I'm not telling you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because by lying and maybe throwing them off, you could save yourself and the other people.
No, of course. And this is like the most famous, example of all, right? I have a very unpopular view about this, which is I think that you should, now I'm not saying I would, right? I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying I have the insight, but I do think that you should avoid telling a lie. I do. And the reason I think that is because I think that is a human being, that even that person who we think of as the epitome of evil, the Nazi, right? They're still a human being and they still need the truth from us. And truth is very powerful. I don't think we should give them information, right? Aquinas has this kind of beautiful advice that I think is very profound, where he says, like, sometimes you are most truthful by saying less, right? Like, if you say less than you have to, you're not lying, right? Because what's actually true is encapsulated if you say less. And I think if you really look at, and we don't have time for it here, but like I think if you really look at what it means to be truthful, right, which is to be accurately depict the world, right? I think most of us don't really know how to be truthful, right? We lie and we say that like we like a Christmas gift because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings, and we're trying to convey a truth, which is like we appreciate the gift, right? But most of us don't really know how to accurately convey all of the feelings we have about like the ugly sweater, right? We don't know how to do that.
Right. Yeah. It's like you want to spare their feelings. If you say downright what you feel,
right,
you're going to be labeled as insensitive and hurtful for saying this ugly.
Right. And so I think the other side of the equation is that the bare facts also sometimes are not truthful, right? So if you tell a small child like an unpleasant, if I kind of gossip to a small child and I like demean my neighbor or their parent or something like that, like I am making this person seem like a monster in my child's eyes. That's not truthful, right? Because I'm not accurately conveying the reality of that person to my child, even if everything I say is true, right? I'm not accurately conveying a correct perception into my child's mind, right? And I think a lot of us just don't know how to be truthful. I think everybody, that's why truth is a virtue, according to Aquinas. Like that's something we have to learn too. And again, I think it comes back to what we mentioned earlier.
Honesty and truth would be the same would fall into the same category?
I think so I would call honesty like not lying.
Okay.
Right. But I think being truthful is conveying an accurate impression of reality to someone else. I
see. Right.
And
so removing bias, essentially.
Removing bias, but actually I don't know that all of us have actually accurate conceptions to begin with, right? Like, if you don't like the person who lives next door very much, do you have an accurate conception of that person? I don't know. Right? How do you speak honestly about that person? Well, one thing you ought to do is recognize that your biases have probably colored, right? And so you ought to be careful what you say about that person. You ought to be suspicious of your ability to accurately describe that person to someone else, right? To be truthful about that.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming. I appreciate
it.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.